Government says it wants to counter Chinese influence, but media rights groups say it's further state repression. So how free is India's media, and what pressures do journalists face there? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Emily Angwin. The detention of dozens of people working in the media in India has been condemned by journalists, organisations, as well as press freedom and civil rights groups. But the BJP government says the raids were carried out to protect national security, claiming media organisations are using secret Chinese funding to undermine the state. The BJP's opponents say the police action is a sign of a further erosion of press freedom in a country often praised for being the world's largest democracy. So what is happening to India's media, and just how free is journalism there? We'll be discussing all that and more with our guests shortly, but first, this report from Bedad Mahichi.
Media office raids and journalists questioned, scenes that are becoming common in India. On Tuesday, it was the turn of a news portal critical of the government. Police searched the office of NewsClick and the homes of several of its writers. Dozens of them were detained, interrogated, and released. Their laptops and mobile phones were seized. NewsClick's editor and a senior executive have been arrested and held.
We have not been given any reason, nor the grounds or the offense committed for which the journalist has been brought here. No such information has been given to either his family members nor to us.
The government defends its move, saying the raids are part of an investigation into suspected illegal foreign funding of the media company. Police registered a case against NewsClick in August, after the New York Times reported the website received funds from a U.S. millionaire. The report accused Neville Roy Singham of working closely with Beijing to push Chinese propaganda worldwide, a charge the tech mogul denies.
If some portal or agency will run China's agenda after taking money from them, such things cannot be allowed to happen in the country. This has happened earlier too. An investigation was going on against them, and now we have concrete evidence that money is coming from China and America, and that money is being used to promote China here.
The opposition accuses authorities of cracking down on voices critical of the government of Prime Minister Narendra Modi.
If this is an attempt to try and muzzle the media and the press, etc., that the media has faced this earlier, they'll also handle it. But what is it? What is the issue? That the country must know.
The crackdown comes months after Indian tax authorities raided the offices of the BBC in New Delhi and Mumbai. The channel aired a documentary critical of Narendra Modi's role in the Gujarat riots in 2002. More than 1,000 people were killed and thousands injured in the unrest between communities in that state. Modi was then its chief minister. Other independent outlets have also been targeted. Most of the searches are carried out under so-called anti-terror powers that critics say are draconian and a misuse of the law.
The police are not listening to us. No application is being accepted. Our clients are not being allowed to sign their legal authorization letters. This is an act of terror. This is an effort to silence people who question the government in any form.
The degree of press freedom in India has plunged since Narendra Modi took charge as Prime Minister in 2014. In this year's World Press Freedom Index of 180 countries, India has dropped to 161 from 150 last year, its lowest ranking on record. Reporters Without Borders, that conducts the annual ranking, warns press freedom is in crisis in India. Bedad Mahichi for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests now. In Mumbai is Rana Ayub, global opinions writer for The Washington Post and author of the Gujarat Files, Anatomy of a Cover-Up. In New Delhi is Shoaib Danyal, political editor of The Scroll News in India. And in Frankfurt is Bei Li, Asia Program Coordinator for the Committee to Protect Journalists. A warm welcome to you all and thanks for joining us on the program. Rana, I'm going to start with you, and it's a simple question. Is press freedom in crisis in the world's largest democracy?
Well, Emily, to begin with, your introduction spoke about the World Press Freedom Index rating that India has now slipped on the 161st position of the World Press Freedom Index, and that speaks volumes. And the fact that at this point of time, journalists are the new enemies of the state, the fact that sedition, UAPA, Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, is being used against journalists just shows how free journalists are in this part of the world, the world's largest democracy. The thing is, what happened to NewsClick yesterday has become a norm at this point of time. Every time a publication, especially independent publication, somebody who's critical of the government, reports, publishes something which goes against the stated line of the government, we see this kind of reprisals against the journalist, whether it is the income tax notice, money laundering. Earlier, it used to be just defamation, but now we have terror laws being invoked against journalists. So yes, we are not as free as we would like to be. In fact, this is probably one of the worst times to be a journalist, an independent journalist critical of the Modi government in India right now.
Rana, I want to pick up on what you said in terms of the laws that they were arrested or detained under. Shoaib, these journalists were arrested under what's known as the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. What is that, and why is it so dangerous for press freedom?
So the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act is actually an anti-terror law, and using that justification is extremely draconian. One of its most draconian actually measures or features is that bail is nearly impossible under the law. So you're basically jailed without trial. So the court is actually forced to accept the version of the prosecution whilst jailing an accused. So which is why it is being widely used, widely employed by the Modi government to silence its critics. So whether it be civil rights activists, and yesterday we saw it be used against two extremely experienced journalists. One of the journalists picked up today was also in a very dark, ironic moment, also picked up in the emergency in 1975, and he has been picked up today under an anti-terror law. So it's such a draconian law that it's impossible to get jailed. So it allows the government to actually imprison people for years on end without trial. And this is why it's such a favorite for the government to use against dissidents and anybody who's reporting or any activist who's organizing and mobilizing against the government.
Lee, this isn't anything new, though, is it? The Indian government has been cracking down on journalists critical of Prime Minister Narendra Modi for some time now. What has your organisation been documenting?
Indeed, this is not the first time. As we heard just now, earlier this year we have seen similar raids. Indeed, the office of NewsClick and the home of some of the journalists were also raided 2 years ago. So since Modi came into power in 2014, at CPJ, we have documented a growing number of cases of journalists being harassed, jailed, and also surveilled because of their critical reporting of the government and the BJP party. But what is most concerning to us at CPJ from yesterday's actions taken against NewsClick is the use of the UAPA yet again to arrest the NewsClick editor and one of the staff. This is the latest example of the weaponizations of security law against journalists for their work.
Rana, you're a journalist working in India. From a personal perspective, can you describe to us what it's like to be a journalist day to day in your country?
Well, Emily, I can still say I'm in a very privileged position to the extent that I have access to a great set of lawyers. I have access to international platforms that show solidarity with me. But yes, it is a difficult job at this point of time because I spend more time with my lawyers than I could as much as I wanted to doing my ground reports. Having said that, I think, Emily, it's very important to point out that there are journalists in the country who are still behind bars under UAPA, especially journalists in Kashmir. 5 of them who are still behind bars under various terror laws, not just UAPA, but also the National Security Act and the Public Safety Act. And some of them have been behind bars for more than 2 years without bail. Journalist Siddiq Kapan was arrested for more than 2 years, was behind bars for more than 2 years because he was on his way to report the gang rape of a lower caste girl. So that's the state of affairs of journalism in India. And what I'm really concerned about, as somebody who's been in this profession for almost more than 15 years now, is the chilling effect this will have on a young generation of journalists, independent journalists specifically, who want to join the profession, who are already in the profession. When they see this kind of, vindictive attitude of the government to critical work, will that dissuade them? Will their families dissuade them from doing the journalism? Because nobody wants cops at their doorstep first thing in the morning. Nobody wants a brown envelope landing up, enforcement directorate, money laundering charges against you or members of your family. It's not a pleasant sight to have cops at your doorstep. So I think it has had a chilling effect. It will have a chilling effect on an entire generation of journalists. For the world's largest democracy, we were a cornerstone of what were liberal ideas and values. The kind of questions which are being asked to what I heard from the media reports to NewsClick journalists is about their coverage of the various protests in India, the farmers' protest or the citizenship protest. So basically, the government is trying to establish a link that anybody who is dissenting or is critical of the government is a propagandist who's working at the behest of international forces, whether it is Chinese funding or Soros. This is the new pattern, and which is dampening.
I wanted to jump in there because I wanted to pick up on what you just said there. Shoaib, do you think that part of the issue is that any critique of the government is seen as anti-national or unpatriotic? Is that part of the issue here?
It's certainly part of the issue. And you know what Rana mentioned, the media is a big part of politics in India. So the Modi government has made it one of its main priorities to control the media. Part of it is done using the carrot. So there are large media houses which do not report critically on the Modi government at all. But for the others, for the small media houses such as NewsClick, who do report critically, who do report from the ground on the situation on the ground, as Rana mentioned, there have been a number of protests which have been a bee in the bonnet for the Modi government. So it's small portals such as this that have reported critically, that have brought voices from the ground, that have disseminated these views. And so for them, there's a stick, and which is a very large stick, which is the anti-terror law, which is just absolutely just mind-blowing that a journalist who's been working for the past decades reporting on the ground will be now called a terrorist in India.
As you mentioned, there is an abundance of media outlets. Lee, if I can direct this question to you, is that abundance in India able to conceal the concentration of ownership? And what impact does that concentration of ownership have on press freedoms?
Well, India is one of the world's largest news industry, and what we are seeing right now, apart from the issues of concentration of media ownership as well, but what we are seeing is really the criminalizations of journalism in India, which is very alarming to us, especially through tactics like using financial charges to target media outlets or individual journalists. This is a growing tactic that we commonly see in other authoritarian regimes, but increasingly is also being used in India. And India is a country where freedom of the speech is guaranteed under the constitution. So this is not the first time we are seeing that similar tactics being used in India to criminalize journalism. Rana and mentions about the farmer protests and also the Delhi protests as well. These are issues that affect the people in India, and this is, they are just reporting about what's going on in the ground, and that's really concerning.
Rana, just staying on the concentration of media ownership for just a moment before we broaden it out. The concentration of media ownership in the country's leading language is Hindi, but would you agree that it's even more marked at a regional level for local language publications?
Well, Emily, there are two sides to it. So there are these big-headed legacy media houses in India, big names, big publications, who are dependent on the government and big business houses for the ads and revenues. The other thing is they don't want to lose access to the government. So I think some of the biggest media houses in India whether it's Hindi or English, are now owned by big business houses who do not want to take cudgels with the government. On the other hand, we have independent news outlets who, like Shoaib works with Scroll. She's the editor of Scroll. There are independent outlets like Scroll, Article 14, and there are other publications in Hindi like Mook Nayak or Maktub. There isn't that kind of funding that these organizations should have, and when they don't have the kind of reach. So the reach of these mainstream legacy media outlets, which is basically most of them are churning out the language that is stated by the government. So at this point of time, we used to have NDTV. For instance, let's take the example of NDTV. One of the independent, so to say, independent media houses who have been critical of the government, and the hostile takeover of the NDTV group by the Adani by the Adani group. Similarly, with other English news channels and Hindi news channels and Hindi news publications, a big part of the censorship emanates from the ownership of these publications, who owns them, and their relationship with those in power. So I think that is a big problem in that affects, and nobody, at the end of the day, nobody wants an enforcement directorate notice at their doorstep. One is that, and second, nobody wants to lose access to those in power.
Shoaib, I noticed you nodding there. Do you think journalists who work for a particular medium, say print versus television or radio, do you think one of those mediums and the journalists that work for them are more vulnerable than the others?
Yes, but it's complex. So TV, I think, is the most vulnerable, but that's because TV has the biggest reach. So it's where the government is most invested in, because it knows it has the biggest political impact. So if you're a TV journalist, there's a lot of pressure on you to conform to a certain political line. So it does play out along those lines to some extent, just because TV has a bigger reach. Coming back to your earlier question around how it plays out around national and regional levels, in a sort of ironic way, I think the regional media in India is actually somewhat freer than the national media, the big media houses, just because of what Rana pointed out, the fact that the corporate control there is more amorphous, it's more mixed. But when it comes to the national media, which the Modi government is very, very invested in controlling, there is a lot of corporate top-down control, and especially in languages such as Hindi and actually even English, where it's actually very difficult to run an independent English or Hindi news channel which reports critically on the government, just because of all the carrots and sticks that will be thrown at you if you do so.
Lee, would you agree with that sentiment, that it's television journalists, or do you think that all journalists, no matter what the communication method, are under threat?
I think we have seen a number of cases affected, journalists, not just Indian journalists, but also foreign media as well. Because increasingly, we are also getting reports about foreign correspondents facing a lot of restrictions in terms of their travel, facing a lot of visa uncertainties. But I think, overall, of course, journalists in India, Indian journalists are still facing the biggest threat, especially maybe those in the region, working for the regional media.
Rana, police said that 37 men and 9 women have been questioned in these recent raids. I know you've been quite vocal about online violence against female journalists. How does gender play a role, if any, in this particular issue?
Well, Emily, I hate to bring myself in this equation, but as a woman and as a Muslim woman critical of the government, the hate is more gendered and bigoted against me. I mean, I just posted a picture of, somebody from, all these right-wing trolls. What they do is they pick up your image from the internet and say, oh, she's a modern dressed woman who advocates for hijab in India. And often online trolling against women, I think, is a little more horrific than it comes to male counterparts, when they are sexualized, when the Twitter trends are more to do with their sexuality, with their gender, where your image is often morphed with to create a narrative about you, to discredit your work. There's an online narrative that also, there's one thing for the government to target and the mainstream media to target and use a government narrative. But the other important player in this is the social media narrative that is being used to tarnish the reputation of journalists who are critical of the government. I mean, whether it is NewsClick or whether it is the BBC or whether it is the independent journalists or foreign journalists, you have Twitter trends against them. Every time a journalist does something which is critical of the government, you will see Twitter trends by bots. And oftentimes, not everybody has the bandwidth to go through this. Not everybody has the mental bandwidth to handle something like this. So it does shut a lot of people down. I know women journalists in India who have gone quiet because of the gendered harassment against them. Not everybody has the bandwidth to fight the internet trolls and the entire social media machinery that goes all out against them. So there's also this battle of narrative. And when journalists are not battling the agencies, they're also battling this mainstream media and the social media narrative that is churned out against them. And that is a very, very effective medium. You have WhatsApp forwards, for instance, right? So there are fact-checking websites who will fact-check the news, but fact-checking websites are a very niche concept. By the time a journalist is discredited, that information has gone viral in the country through WhatsApp forwards. So that journalist is made an enemy of the state. So whether the prosecuting agency can prosecute or produce the evidence against the journalist is for a later stage. But before that, you discredit the journalist and their work, which is critical of the government. And that is something this government has done effectively.
And that brings me to my next question. Shoaib, how can journalists fight back?
I think journalists can fight back using the only tool journalists know, which is to report. And I think yesterday was a tough day for all Indian journalists. And it, I think, left our community shaken. The fact that it's so easy to imprison senior members, senior colleagues, such as people at NewsClick. But I think all we can do is just put our heads down and report and do our job and hope that the country will turn around for the better. And we can play a small part in that.
Lee, what do you think the future holds for journalism in India specifically?
I very much agree that, the best way for us to, the future for journalism is to continue reporting, as Soha said just now, that, this is what we do best. And I truly believe that facts will win one day. And also, I think India once had this very strong traditions of a free press. It must return to this if it really wants to live up to the reputations of being the world's largest democracy, which goes well beyond the ability to hold elections. It's up to the Indian government to decide what it wants to be. It can be the mother of democracy, or it can be the graveyard of democracy.
Rana, the United States has called for respect for the media, but has declined to weigh in on reports of NewsClick's relationship with China. Do you want Washington to step up? What do you want from the international community more broadly?
I think what I expect is for the journalism organizations internationally, and not as much governments, but more journalism organizations to kind of speak in solidarity with journalists everywhere. Because, if the profession is under attack, I don't think governments, because governments have can wane on something like this. I think it's journalism organizations or journalism publications that need to speak up for their colleagues everywhere in the world. Just like, journalists spoke in solidarity when Jamal Khashoggi was murdered. We need that kind of solidarity from journalists globally about what is happening, because as Shoaib said, yesterday was a very depressing day for journalists, and I want to say that I wonder if this is going to dissuade young journalists in India, right? How do we create a safer space for them? How do we make sure that they do not fear imprisonment for even tweeting something against the government? So I think international journalism bodies and international media should stay, should have the back of their journalists who are working in India, and independent journalists in India who are working at great risk to their life. They don't have legal access. I think journalism bodies should do more to protect these independent journalists who are working at great risk to their lives.
Shoaib, how has the Indian public reacted? What have you heard anecdotally or when you've gone out on the streets in New Delhi? Well, how have people reacted to these raids and these arrests?
So those reactions will come in, but one thing that I want to sort of put forward is the distortion of media in India has had a real impact on the Indian public. and it has a very bad impact, a very poor impact in that people have lost trust in the media. So people right now, they don't trust a lot of what the Indian media is putting out because they realize that, the large parts of the media acting as mouthpieces of the government. So this is something that you will hear often. In fact, sometimes you will even hear it from people who support the BJP, right? So there are well-meaning people who would support the BJP maybe. So they would also not believe what pro-government channels are sort of putting out. And, we might sort of get lost in the political tussle, but honestly, this is very bad for Indian democracy. You can't have a democracy. You simply cannot have a democracy in which the media is not believed. I mean, it's a mythical animal. And I hope that political conditions can pull us back from that precipice so that we don't tip over.
And Rana, the next Indian general election is expected to be held in a few months' time, about 6 months' time, potentially between April and May of 2024. Are you expecting a further crackdown by the Indian government in the coming months?
Well, I don't want to sound like a cynic, but the way things are looking right now, I expect further crackdown, and not just journalists, but civil rights activists, dissenters, members of the opposition. I think it is going to be a very, very tough time ahead of the general elections, because what we are witnessing now, just 6 months into the general election, has given us a preview on what lies ahead, and that is what is extremely distressing.
Well, I think the state of journalism is in strong hands with the three of you. We appreciate your time on this edition of The Inside Story. Thank you so much. Thanks to all of our guests, Rana Ayub, Shoaib Danyal and Bailey Yi. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X, formerly known as Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Emily Angwin, and the whole team here, bye for now.